Your father just passed away and you realize that you inherited nothing, yet your stepbrothers inherited everything. I'm going to talk a little bit about the complex financial planning that has to happen for blended families that you may not see in a traditional family. There are four specific components that I'm going to talk through today. Number one is your basic financial planning. It's financial literacy that happened prior to the marriage. These are things like spending habits, assets that have been accumulated prior to the marriage. The second component is shared expenses. So now that you are married, there may be a disparity in terms of income, and it's determining what type of expenses will be covered by which income, or in some cases, if you are combining your income. The third is the most complex, and that's estate planning. And so if you don't have a trust in place, that is extremely important because a will is not going to be enough. And then the fourth component is really psychological. It's really around financial transparency. It's making sure that you are both on the same page in terms of your wishes, your expectations, and how you want everything to flow from a financial standpoint within your family. Because having a blended family is challenging enough, just making sure that everyone gets along, let alone from a financial standpoint, which can cause a lot of tension and emotions to happen that can be avoided with the proper financial planning. So let's talk a little bit about the financial literacy or the financial planning that happened before the marriage. So you want to look at areas such as spending habits. You may have one spouse that had discretionary income that they prefer to spend instead of save. So going into the marriage, they may not have as high of assets because most of that money was spent. You may have another spouse that wanted to live a more modest lifestyle because they wanted to save more for their kids' education, or they wanted to save more for retirement. But at the time, they didn't want to spend, they wanted to save. Now, that's important for a couple different reasons. As you enter the marriage, one of the discussions that should happen is around your individual assets and determining what that's going to look like post-marriage. Now, there's prenuptial agreements, which I know have gotten a bad reputation, but in reality, it's actually a very strategic way to avoid future conflict. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're saying, hey, we're going to, at some point, dissolve this marriage, but it's just important to understand and come to an agreement on what assets belong to which spouse so that you can dictate post-marriage what that is going to look like in terms of achieving your goals and having your wishes fulfilled. So understanding that spending habits and which assets will belong to whom post-marriage is important. Because once you get married, that's when you want to set a baseline, and hopefully the assets that you accumulate going forward are shared assets, or if you have a different way that you want to split them up, that's how you want to determine what that looks like. So let's look at expenses. So expenses are important to review. As you get married, you're going to want to look at how the expenses are going to be split up for each spouse. Now, there may be an income disparity here, which even adds a higher layer of complexity to this. But I'm going to use just a simple example to kind of give you an idea of how the expenses can be looked at in some areas that may cause some challenges. So let's say that one spouse has two children that they believe very strongly it's important for them to support them when it comes to covering expenses for vehicles. So maybe they have a car and that spouse covers the car payment, the insurance payment, the gas. And the idea is as long as you get good grades and that you are doing well, I'm going to go ahead and cover those expenses for you. The other spouse may have a different mindset, and maybe they grew up where it was important to have that work ethic and that they had to earn their vehicle and pay their own expenses. So going into the marriage, that was the mindset. So maybe their children are paying for their own expenses. Well, now you're married and you have two different types of ways to look at expenses. So it's important to have that conversation to determine, are you going to continue to have that type of mentality, or are you going to look at different ways that maybe you can change what you've been doing in the past? In addition to that, there are other expenses that can come into play, things like child support, things like alimony. Those type of expenses may be applicable to one spouse but not the other. And so that question then becomes is, are we sharing the income in terms of, do I need to help pay for that alimony or child support, or is that something that you're responsible for? So these are some factors that will come up, and it's important to have that discussion early on so that you are both on the same page in terms of how you will cover that. Estate planning, this is the most complex part, and it's where I see a lot of blended families have a big challenge, and it can lead to a lot of conflict, especially when one spouse passes away. So as I mentioned earlier, there are going to be assets that are accumulated prior to marriage, but there's also going to be assets that will be accumulated post-marriage. And so taking the time to sit down and build a trust that covers all of each of your wishes and goals, it's a very important step to take. Now, a lot of times what I see is that there are many people that have a will, and a will is just not going to be enough for a blended family because there's so many different parties that will be involved. And so a basic trust, for those of you that aren't familiar with a trust, is essentially you are taking the opportunity to pool your assets together and dictate essentially where those assets will go once you pass. In a traditional family, those assets are typically passed on to the spouse, but they still have the kids as beneficiaries, the kids that they have within the family. Now, when you're looking at a blended family, now you're adding an additional layer of complexity where those assets now need to be looked at in terms of where they go. Do they go to the spouse? Do they go to your kids? Do they go to your stepchildren? So that's where this adds that layer of complexity. So I'm going to use just a very simple example of how this can and cannot work. So let's say that one spouse has $1 million worth of assets and the other spouse has $500,000. So the spouse with $1 million is really concerned that once they pass, maybe they want to ensure that their spouse has enough income to support their expenses going forward. But it's very important that the actual assets, the $1 million, goes to their children and not necessarily go to their stepchildren. So in this example, when you put together a trust, you can put together what's called a Q-tip trust. And essentially what a Q-tip trust does exactly what I just mentioned. So upon your passing, the $1 million goes into this trust, which then provides income to your spouse, but those assets then belong to your children as beneficiaries. So once your spouse passes away, those assets will then go straight to your kids. So that's one way to set it up. It's a very clean and easy way to do it. And again, it accomplishes the goal of providing for your spouse, but then also ensuring that the assets that you've built go to your children. Now, as you accumulate assets post-marriage, that's where it can get a little sticky, because then that's where you're determining how you want to split those assets between multiple children. So that's a different level of planning that you're going to want to sit down and talk through as a newly married couple. So estate planning can get extremely complex. There's different ways that you can structure how you want your assets and what type of wishes and goals that you have post-death. Now, the last part should be a given, but believe it or not, this is also something that I come across that can cause a lot of conflict, and that's financial transparency. So going into the marriage, hopefully each of the parties, each of the spouses have done a good job of making each other aware of their total asset, their total financial picture. That's important because what you don't want to have is, post-marriage, one spouse finding out about an asset that was not disclosed prior to marriage. That typically doesn't happen, but it's something that you want to make sure as a married couple that you do go through. Now, post-marriage, you want to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what type of spending is happening. If you are spending more money on your kids than you are spending on your stepkids, and that's not something that's communicated to your spouse, that can cause some tension and some conflict. So coming to the table on a regular basis and doing something just as simple as a budget review and making sure each of you are aware of all the different types of accounts that you have is an easy way to make sure that this does not become a problem in the future. That being said, if it does happen, and you do catch this, it's important to have that conversation early on to make sure that you both are on the same page in terms of, again, tying back into the second component, which is understanding how the expenses are covered, to utilize that opportunity to make sure that you are drawing back and having that conversation that you should have already had in terms of how expenses are paid. So these 4 components are just a few of the areas that are important for blended families as they look at doing the proper financial planning that is going to be different than your traditional families. So if you have any questions or you want to go over specific questions around your situations, reach out to us. You can click on the link below and schedule your free 30-minute strategy session. You can also subscribe to all of our channels. We try to post content on different types of topics. But if there's some questions you have specifically to this one, reach out to us through that link and schedule your session today.